I can't believe that the woman I rescued from poverty is now lying before me. In shock. With him, I caught them. This is how she chose to repay me for everything LV done for her. She did this with him right in front of our child. She will regret this. She says I don't satisfy her fully? Oh, I'll satisfy her so much that she'll beg me to stop. And that will only be the beginning, the start of destroying her life. She's the one to blame for all of this, for everything she's done, everything she's brought into our family. I'll do this to her, and I'll make sure everyone knows. I'll force her to beg me on her knees. But let me start from the beginning. It began, like most of my terrible ideas, with a trip I didn't even want to take. Africa, a business venture, they said. Opportunity, they said. What they didn't say was that the heat would feel like walking into a furnace, and that the local food would leave me running for the bathroom more times than I care to admit. But amid the chaos of dusty roads and bustling markets, I saw her. Amina. She wasn't like anyone I'd ever seen before. Sure, I'd been around beautiful women, heck, I'd dated a few. But this was different. She didn't just turn heads. She made you forget what you were doing entirely. I was in the middle of bargaining for a carved wooden lion, which I didn't even want, when she walked past. My words froze mid-sentence. The vendor, thinking he'd won the negotiation, laughed and upped the price. I didn't care. Her figure was like poetry, except the kind you don't read in front of your parents. She had curves in all the right places, the kind that made me want to commit sins I didn't even know existed. Her skin glowed, kissed by the sun in a way that made it look like she carried the light with her. And her walk, confident, yet unassuming, like she didn't know the power she held. Now, before you think this is some love at first sight nonsense, let me stop you. It wasn't love, not even close. I wasn't some romantic hero swept off his feet by destiny. No, it was pure, unfiltered desire. The kind that makes a man reckless. I didn't want to know her favorite color or what she dreamed about at night. I wanted her, plain and simple. Of course, I didn't walk up to her and say that. I'm not a monster. Instead, I did what any self-respecting man would do. I asked around. The locals must have thought I was crazy, stumbling through the market like a lovesick teenager. Eventually, I found out who she was, where she lived, and most importantly, how to meet her family. Meeting her family was an experience, and to my surprise, they agreed. Maybe it was the promise of a better life for Amina, or maybe they saw something in me I didn't even see in myself. Either way, a few weeks later, she was boarding a plane with me to my world. A place so far removed from the life she'd known that I could see the nervousness in her every move. She didn't talk much during the flight. Just small, polite answers to my questions and an occasional glance out the window. Her eyes, dark and wide, held a mix of fear and curiosity. It hit me then, what I was doing was more than just bringing home a beautiful woman. I was uprooting her life, placing her in a world she didn't understand, and expecting her to adapt. But I told myself it was fair. I'd give her a good life, one free of struggle. And in return, she'd be mine. Completely, unconditionally. Looking back now, I can't help but laugh at how naive I was. I thought I was in control, the one calling the shots. Little did I know, the woman beside me on that plane would unravel my life in ways I never saw coming. But in that moment, I wasn't thinking about the future. I was just a man with a plan, bringing home what I thought would be the perfect solution to all my restless nights. Turns out, life doesn't work that way. And if I'd known what was coming, maybe I'd have stayed in that market, overpaying for wooden lions and keeping my desires to myself. Well, maybe. At first, our life together was practical. I gave her a home, security, and comfort. She, in return, cleaned, cooked, and cared for me like she owed me her every breath. It wasn't love. It wasn't romance. It was a system that worked. But over time, something shifted. Maybe it was the way she hummed softly to herself while sweeping the floor, or how she called me by my name in that funny accent that never failed to amuse me. Or maybe it was the stories she told, of running barefoot through fields in her village, of her mother braiding her hair under the shade of an old tree. There was a warmth to her, a vulnerability that I couldn't help but be drawn to. And then came the baby. It wasn't planned, not by a long shot. But when I held that tiny, squirming life in my hands, something inside me changed. The self-proclaimed womanizer who swore never to settle down suddenly found himself a family man. Amina, for her part, was incredible. She took to motherhood like she'd been preparing for it her whole life. Even after long, sleepless nights, she would wake early to clean the house, prepare meals, and tend to every need our child could have. I watched her, tireless and devoted, and felt something I hadn't expected: love. Not the shallow kind I thought I understood, but a deeper, quieter love that came from building a life together. She seemed perfect, not just beautiful, but strong, resilient, and endlessly giving. She became the mother of my child, the heart of my home. And without realizing it, I began to believe that maybe I could love her forever. The house came alive the day Amina's family arrived. It was the first time I'd met them since we'd married, and they brought with them an energy that was both foreign and infectious. Laughter echoed through the halls, mingling with the rhythmic beat of drums and the mouth-watering aromas of dishes I couldn't even begin to pronounce. They had come to celebrate their cultural holiday, and with it, the 6-month milestone of our baby. I'll admit, I felt like an outsider in my own home. The language, the songs, the traditions, it was a world I barely understood. But as I watched them laugh and sing, I couldn't deny the warmth they brought. Amina was radiant that day. She seemed more alive, more vibrant than I'd seen her in months. She moved effortlessly between her relatives, laughing with her cousins, holding her mother's hand, and tossing knowing smiles at her father. But it wasn't all perfect. Her younger brother, Idris, caught my attention immediately. He was wiry, with sharp eyes that seemed to take in everything without giving much away. While the others embraced me with polite smiles and warm handshakes, Idris hung back, watching me with an expression I couldn't quite place. He was quiet, speaking only when spoken to, but when he did, his words carried a weight that demanded attention. He had a calm confidence, the kind that comes from someone who's seen more than they let on. I didn't like it. More than that, I didn't like how Amina seemed different around him. She, who was so full of life that day, became reserved in his presence. Her laughter softened, her movements slowed, and she avoided his gaze whenever possible. It wasn't obvious, at least not to anyone else, but I noticed. That night, after everyone had eaten their fill, Idris joined me for a drink. He sat across from me, his posture relaxed but his eyes sharp, as if he were testing me. Over the clink of glasses, he began to talk about their childhood. He told me how they grew up with little but love to sustain them. Their father worked long hours, their mother sold vegetables in the market, and the children looked out for one another. He spoke of Amina with a peculiar mix of pride and nostalgia, recalling how she used to run barefoot through the fields, her laughter carrying over the hills. She was always the favorite, he said, his voice carrying an edge I couldn't quite place. Everyone adored her, protected her. She's special. I wanted to feel moved by his stories, but something about the way he spoke unsettled me. His words seemed warm, but his tone was cold, as though he were speaking less to me and more to himself. When Idris looked at Amina that night, something flickered in his gaze. Something I couldn't name but couldn't ignore. I told myself I was being paranoid. He was her brother, after all, and families had complicated dynamics. Still, the unease settled in my gut like a stone. As the celebration stretched into the night, I found myself withdrawing to the edges of the room, watching more than participating. Amina's smile never wavered, but I noticed how often she glanced at Idris. Not with affection or even casual familiarity, but with something closer to nervousness. It was subtle, fleeting, but once I noticed it, I couldn't unsee it. When the evening ended and her family began to leave, Idris was the last to go. He shook my hand, his grip firm but not too tight, his smile polite but hollow. As he turned to Amina, he spoke in their language, too fast and quiet for me to catch. Her response was equally soft, but the tension in her shoulders was unmistakable. That night, as Amina lay sleeping beside me, I replayed the day in my mind. The songs, the stories, the food, they were a blur. But Idris's watchful gaze and the unease in Amina's demeanor stuck with me. I told myself I was imagining things, that it was nothing. I should have trusted my instincts. After her family left, the house felt quieter, almost hollow. At first, I thought it was just the aftermath of all the energy they had brought. But soon, I realized it wasn't the house that had changed. It was Amina. She began dressing differently, trading her modest, comfortable clothes for outfits that hugged her curves in a way that felt deliberate. She looked stunning, of course, but there was something off about it. Like she was dressing for an audience I couldn't see. Her laughter, once so natural and infectious, now felt forced, as though she were performing. She avoided my gaze more often than not, brushing past me with hurried excuses and distracted smiles. It was subtle at first, but then I noticed the hours she spent on her phone, her fingers tapping out messages with a focus that shut the rest of the world out. When I asked, she'd say she was checking in with her family, keeping up with their lives back home. One night, I overheard her whispering into the phone. She was speaking in her native tongue, her words soft and quick, punctuated by a laugh I hadn't heard in months. It wasn't the polite laugh she gave me when I cracked one of my lame jokes. It was real, full of warmth and something else I couldn't place. Sent a chill down my spine. "Who are you talking to?" I asked, my voice calm, though my insides churned. She startled, turning toward me with wide eyes before quickly composing herself. "My cousin," she said lightly, waving it off as though it were nothing. Her explanation felt wrong, but I let it go, for now. Still, the distance between us grew. I began to feel like an outsider in my own home, watching as Amina slipped further away from me. Her behavior didn't just bother me. It gnawed at me, piece by piece, until suspicion became an itch I couldn't ignore. She started leaving the house more often, claiming she had errands to run or was meeting new friends. It might have sounded reasonable to anyone else, but the inconsistencies in her stories kept piling up. One day, she said she'd gone to the market, but when I checked the kitchen, there were no new groceries. Another time, she came back later than she said she would. Her cheeks flushed and her hair slightly tousled. I tried to push the doubts aside. I wanted to trust her, to believe that I was imagining things. But the unease in my chest refused to fade. One afternoon, I couldn't take it anymore. When she said she was heading to the grocery store, I waited a few minutes and then followed her. I told myself I was being paranoid, that I'd find her exactly where she said she'd be and feel like an idiot. But she wasn't at the store. I spotted her at the park instead, sitting on a bench. She wasn't alone. A man sat beside her, leaning in just a little too close. From where I was, I couldn't see his face clearly, but the way they sat, shoulders almost touching, made my stomach twist. I stayed hidden, watching as she laughed at something he said. Her hand brushed her hair back, a gesture so small and yet so intimate that it felt like a slap to my face. By the time she returned home that evening, I was a storm of anger and confusion. "Where were you?" I asked, keeping my voice steady despite the fire inside me. She smiled, too quickly, and said, "At the store, like I told you." Her lie hung in the air between us, so blatant I could almost choke on it. But I didn't confront her, not yet. Instead, I nodded and let her words settle like a stone in my chest. I needed proof, something undeniable, because deep down I already knew the truth. I just wasn't ready to face it. It was a Wednesday. I remember because I'd left work early, tired of the endless meetings and petty office politics. I just wanted to go home, sit on the couch, and enjoy some peace. As I stepped into the house, the quietness struck me. The baby's soft coos usually filled the air, or Amina's hums as she worked in the kitchen. But that day it was different, eerily still until I heard it. At first I thought I was mistaken. A muffled noise, barely audible, coming from the direction of our bedroom. My stomach tightened. Something felt off. As I climbed the stairs, The sounds became clearer. Movement, whispers, and then a low, breathless laugh. A laugh I knew too well. A laugh that didn't belong in this moment. My pulse quickened, dread rising like bile in my throat. The door was ajar. I pushed it open, and the world I knew shattered in an instant. There they were, Amina and Idris, tangled in the bed we had shared. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. My mind refused to process what I was seeing. This wasn't just infidelity. It was something darker. Something that twisted everything I thought I knew about her. About them. About us. A guttural roar erupted from me before I even realized I'd made a sound. Chaos followed. Idris scrambled, nearly falling as he pulled on his pants. I barely registered his stammered excuses as I lunged toward him, my fist connecting with his jaw. He stumbled backward, clutching his face, before bolting out of the room like the coward he was. Amina, still wrapped in the bedsheet, fell to her knees, her face streaked with tears. "Let me explain," she cried, her voice trembling, her hands outstretched as though reaching for my mercy. But I had none to give. The room spun around me, the defiled bed, the open door to the nursery down the hall, the echoes of their betrayal reverberating in my mind. My child, our child, sleeping innocently just feet away while this filth unfolded in the home I'd built for them. I couldn't speak. Words felt too small, too insignificant to contain the fury and heartbreak tearing through me. Instead, I turned and stormed out, her desperate sobs following me as I slammed the door behind me. Downstairs, I paced, fists clenched, trying to steady my breathing, trying to make sense of what I'd just seen. But no sense could be made. The woman I had trusted, the woman I had loved, had not only betrayed me but had done so with someone who was supposed to protect her. When Amina finally came downstairs, she fell to her knees again, her voice hoarse from crying. "Please," she begged, her tears falling onto the floor. It was a mistake, a terrible mistake. I stared at her, a stranger in my home, the weight of her betrayal pressing down on me. My hands shook, not from fear, but from the sheer force of containing my rage. "I gave you everything," I finally said, my voice low, trembling. "Everything. And this is what you do." She couldn't meet my gaze. Her sobs grew louder, her words disjointed as she tried to explain herself. But I didn't want to hear her excuses. Not then. Not ever. Something in me hardened at that moment, a part of me I didn't know existed. Love, trust, forgiveness, they all vanished, leaving only anger and an unrelenting need for retribution. Because this wasn't just betrayal. This was war. The house was suffocating that night. Amina's cries echoed through the walls as I sat in the living room, staring blankly at the darkened TV screen. I had replayed the scene upstairs so many times in my mind that it felt etched into my skull. Her betrayal, Idris's cowardly escape. It all burned like an open wound. When she finally came downstairs, her steps hesitant, her face swollen with tears, I didn't move. I couldn't trust myself to even look at her. She fell to her knees before me, her hands clasped together in a desperate plea. "Please," she sobbed, her voice breaking. "I don't know why I did it. It was a mistake. A terrible mistake." I stayed silent, my gaze fixed on the floor as she poured out her apologies. She called it a moment of weakness, blamed confusion, stress, and whatever else she could muster. Her tears dripped onto the carpet, her voice trembling with regret as she begged me not to destroy the family we'd built together. But her words were nothing but noise to me. When I didn't respond, something shifted in her. Her sobs gave way to frustration, her voice rising, her tone sharper. "You haven't been the same," she said, her words laced with accusation. "You don't see me. You don't touch me the way you used to." My jaw clenched, but I said nothing. "You've been distant," she continued, her tears turning venomous. "You don't fulfill me. Do you think this was easy for me? Do you think I wanted this?" Her voice cracked on the last word, and for the first time that night, I looked at her. Her face was a mixture of anger and sorrow, her lips trembling as she stared back at me, hoping, no, demanding a response. Something inside me snapped. "I don't fulfill you?" I said, my voice quiet but seething. "I gave you everything. I turned my life inside out for you. And this is how you repay me?" Her defiance faltered, her hands shaking as she tried to justify herself. But the words were meaningless now. I stood, towering over her as she remained on her knees. For a fleeting moment, I felt pity, an old, dying remnant of the love I'd once held for her. But it was gone as quickly as it came, replaced by something darker, colder. Her betrayal wasn't just a mistake. It was a choice. And if she thought I wasn't enough for her, I'd show her exactly what enough looked like. Her words haunted me for days. "You don't fulfill me." They played on a loop in my mind, twisting my anger into something sharper, more focused. She had shattered our family, defiled our home, and humiliated me in ways I couldn't have imagined. But her excuses, her accusations, those cut the deepest. If I wasn't enough for her, then I'd make her regret those words for the rest of her life. I began to plan, not in the heat of rage, but with cold, deliberate precision. Every detail had to be perfect, every step calculated. This wouldn't be a quick outburst of revenge. It would be a slow, unrelenting punishment. I watched her closely, pretending to forgive her, letting her believe I was trying to move past it. She clung to the hope, desperate to repair what she'd broken. I let her cook for me, clean for me, smile through her tears as though she could earn back my love. But there was no love left, only resolve. I would remind her of her betrayal every single day. I would take everything she had given to Idris, her trust, her body, her soul, and twist it into something she could no longer bear. She thought I had been distant before. She had no idea how close I could get, how overwhelming I could be. This wasn't about forgiveness. This was about making her beg. Not for love, not for redemption, but for mercy. And mercy was the one thing I would never give. The first step was simple. Sever the ties that connected her to the outside world. She had betrayed me in the most intimate way, and now her world would shrink to the size of her guilt. And me. Started with her phone. I took it one morning while she was still asleep. She woke up panicked, her hands searching under pillows and between sheets. "Where's my phone?" she asked, her voice shaky. "I put it away," I said, my tone flat, offering no explanation. She didn't argue at first. She probably thought this was some kind of temporary punishment, another step in my cold silence. But when days turned into weeks, and the phone never reappeared, the cracks began to show. "I need to call my family," she said one night, her voice trembling. "They don't need to hear from you," I replied. "Not after what you've done." Her protests grew louder, more desperate, but I shut them down with the same unyielding calm. When she tried using the landline, I disconnected it. When she asked to go out, I told her there was no need. Everything she could possibly need, I reminded her, was right here at home. Her isolation wasn't just physical, it was emotional. I made sure of that. When her friends called to check on her, I intercepted the calls, offering vague excuses or telling them outright that she wasn't available. Eventually, the calls stopped. At first, she tried to keep herself busy, throwing herself into housework or spending long hours with our child. But even that began to lose its solace. The walls of the house became a cage, and she was trapped inside it. The vibrant, spirited woman I had once known began to fade. She stopped humming as she cleaned. Her eyes, once so alive, now seemed dull and distant. Even her posture changed. Her shoulders hunched as though the weight of my presence pressed down on her. She tried to reach me in small ways, cooking my favorite meals, setting the table with the same care she once had. But I refused to acknowledge her efforts. If she thought she could earn my forgiveness through gestures, she was wrong. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. My silence was louder than any words, my control more suffocating than any shout. The house grew quieter with each passing day, the laughter and warmth replaced by the cold, unspoken tension that hung between us. She was no longer Amina, the woman who had once brightened my life. She was a shadow of herself, and that was exactly what I wanted. Because shadows can't betray you. If her betrayal had been physical, then it was only fitting that her punishment would be the same. She had accused me of not fulfilling her, of being distant, of not being enough. Those words played over and over in my mind, fueling a dark resolve. I would give her what she wanted, or at least what she claimed to want. Started subtly, like the tightening of a noose. I let her believe I was softening, that the cold wall of my silence was beginning to thaw. I touched her more often, not gently, but with a possessiveness that left no doubt about who she belonged to. At first, she seemed hopeful, eager even, mistaking my intensity for a desire to rebuild what she had shattered. But hope quickly turned to dread as she realized this wasn't about love or reconciliation. This was about control. Night after night, I demanded her submission. She became a canvas for my anger, my frustration, my need to reclaim what she had stolen from me. Her complaints of being unfulfilled were silenced with overwhelming, relentless force. Her tears didn't stop me. They only spurred me on. When she pleaded for mercy, her voice breaking with exhaustion, I ignored her. Mercy wasn't something she deserved. She had taken my trust, my pride, and my love, and left them in tatters. This was the price she would pay. Her body, once vibrant and defiant, grew weaker under the strain. She flinched at my touch, her eyes hollow and distant as she realized there was no escape from this new reality. But that was the point, to remind her, every single night, that her betrayal had consequences she would never forget. In the quiet hours after, as she lay curled up beside me, trembling, I felt no guilt, only satisfaction. She had complained of being unfulfilled, and now she had more than enough. She would never say those words again. Control within the home wasn't enough. Amina's betrayal had been intimate, but the humiliation I carried felt public, as if the world could see the cracks she had carved into my pride. I couldn't live with the silence of it, so I turned her shame into a spectacle. It started with whispers. I let slip to a neighbor that my wife had been unfaithful, not just with any man, but with her own brother. The scandal spread like wildfire. Neighbors exchanged knowing looks, the women muttering behind cupped hands whenever Amina walked by. The first time she noticed the stares, she came home confused. "Why are they looking at me like that?" she asked, her voice tinged with unease. I shrugged, keeping my expression neutral. "Maybe they know," I said, the words hanging in the air like a dagger. Her face went pale. The whispers became louder, the stares bolder. People avoided her in the market, shopkeepers turned cold, and friends she once leaned on no longer returned her calls. Her beauty, once admired and envied, became a source of scorn. One night, she confronted me, tears streaming down her face. "Did you tell them?" she demanded, her voice shaking. I didn't deny it. "The truth has a way of coming out," I said coldly. "Maybe now you'll understand what it feels like to be humiliated." She crumpled to the floor, sobbing, but I felt no pity. Her shame was her own doing, and the world's judgment was her burden to bear. The whispers turned to silence. No one would speak to her, no one would acknowledge her. The once vibrant Amina who could light up a room now walked through life with her head bowed, her steps hesitant, as if afraid the earth would swallow her whole. At home, she begged daily for forgiveness. She promised to change, to be the wife I deserved. She cried until her voice grew hoarse, until the skin under her eyes darkened from exhaustion. "Please," she would whisper at night, her hands clutching at my arm. "I'll do anything. Just give me a chance." Her desperation became a constant presence, but I barely noticed it anymore. Her cries, once sharp and jarring, faded into background noise, a dull hum that barely registered in my mind. She no longer ate much, her once curvy figure now thinner, more fragile. Even her movements seemed tentative, as though she feared her very existence might anger me. I watched her crumble, day by day, and felt nothing. She had begged me to listen, begged me to stop, begged me to forgive, but she had begged too late. Amina was broken, and I made sure she stayed that way. Taking her dignity wasn't enough. The ultimate punishment lay in removing the one thing she still clung to, their child. Amina's love for our baby had been unwavering, even through the chaos and torment. That bond, unbroken by shame or despair, was the only light left in her shattered world. And so, I resolved to extinguish it. I filed for full custody with an unrelenting ferocity. I documented every detail of her betrayal, her affair with Idris, the public disgrace she had brought to our family, and her emotional instability. In court, I was calm and calculated, portraying myself as the devoted father who had been wronged, and her as a woman unfit to raise our child. Amina tried to fight. She pleaded with the judge, tears streaming as she insisted she was still a good mother. But the evidence was insurmountable. The scandal, the whispers, the shame. It all painted a picture she couldn't refute. When the ruling came, I watched as her world fell apart. The court granted me full custody, citing her actions as proof of her inability to provide a stable environment. Amina collapsed in the courtroom, her sobs echoing in the silent space. She clutched at the table, gasping for air, as though the weight of the decision had physically crushed her. She tried to speak to me afterward, her voice trembling as she begged, "Please, don't take my baby away." But I walked past her without a word, my resolve unshaken. Her defeat was absolute. She had lost her pride, her standing, and now her child. And I, for a fleeting moment, felt a dark sense of satisfaction. The day she left was quiet. She packed her few remaining belongings in silence, her movements slow and mechanical, like a puppet whose strings had been cut. I stood in the doorway, watching her, waiting for the moment she would finally be gone. As she stepped outside, carrying the last of her things, she turned to look at me one final time. Her face was hollow, her eyes vacant, as though everything that made her Amina had been drained away. There were no words, no pleas, no accusations, just a heavy, suffocating silence. I felt a strange mix of triumph and emptiness as I closed the door behind her. The revenge I had so meticulously crafted was complete. She had paid for her betrayal in every way possible, stripped of her dignity, her freedom, and her family. I had won. And yet, as I sat in the quiet house, holding the child we had once created out of love, I couldn't shake the hollowness that lingered. The walls, once filled with her laughter, now echoed with an oppressive stillness. I had destroyed her, but in doing so, I had destroyed something in myself as well. The man who had loved her, who had built a life with her, no longer existed. What remained was a stranger, bound to the wreckage of what once was. Was it worth it? The question lingered in the back of my mind, gnawing at the edges of my thoughts. I told myself it was, that justice had been served, that she had earned her suffering. But in the quiet moments, when the echoes of her cries faded and I was left with nothing but my own thoughts, I wasn't so sure. Revenge had been sweet, but its aftertaste was bitter. And as I stared at the empty space where she had once stood, I wondered if the cost of my victory had been too high.